Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Hypertrophy Past and Present. Good morning. It's my morning for the first time. Normally I do. Last time I had an evening coffee, and now it's a morning coffee for me. So good morning, Chris. How are you today?
I'm doing very well, thank you. It's good to be back after all my travels. I've been jetting around all over the place. It's nice to be in a settled place for the time being at an undisclosed location.
A little bit of stability. How good. Just before we jump into today's episode, I do want to mention there's a few comments and stuff people have been leaving on the podcast, and thank you guys for engaging. Thank you guys for commenting and liking and sharing, all that good stuff. I will just mention if you guys do have questions, both yourself and we both do Q&As every week. So if you do have questions on anything we've covered in the podcast or past episode, or even things you want us to talk about, you're more than welcome to engage in our Q&As. I love seeing the dialogue and the engagement on the podcast, but we don't tend to monitor that as much and answer questions there. So if you guys do have questions on what we're going to talk about today or what we've talked about in the past, hop onto our Instagram and engage in our Q&A. So let's jump into today's topic. Now, I'm going to start with a plan. But before I start with our workout plan, I do want to just mention what we're actually going to talk about today and why I want to talk about this particular plan. And I want to give a little bit of context as to how this plan might be a little bit different to some other plans as well. So today we're going to talk about warming up. Warm-up sets. What is a warm-up? Why do it? Do you need to do it? How do you do it? And a question I get a lot with these silver era plans is, what do they do for warm-ups? And I think a lot of people have noticed, and you guys listening, you may have noticed when I talk about these programs in the past, I often don't talk about any warming up. And that's because they often don't talk about any warming up. And there's a few exceptions to that. So I did want to mention we have talked about a few of Reg Park's plans. And in my opinion, I'd say Reg Park is probably the most notable or explicit, I guess, with his types of warming up sets. So he does talk about them very clearly, and he does suggest doing 2 warm-up sets before, like his 5x5. The first 2 sets of those are warm-up sets. And he actually explains like what percentages to use, and he's very clear with that. But that's a little bit of an outlier for some of these plans. And generally speaking, these plans, I'd say at least half the time, they don't talk about warming up at all. So I'm assuming that this is kind of like assumed knowledge. People kind of knew what they were doing, right? So the plan I want to talk about today, they outline another way of warming up, which is different to what Reg suggested. This is probably the most common type of warming up I see talked about in the pre-steroid era. So it's different to how Reg did it, where he did it specifically for those exercises he was doing in that workout. So today's plan is a York barbell plan. So we have talked about one York course in the past, which was the York Mr. America course. So York, obviously, the head of York Barbell was Bob Hoffman, very, very influential figure in the silver era. He was an Olympic weightlifting coach for America. He coached many of the first Mr. Universes, including John Kremick, and arguably certainly one of the most influential people in pre-steroid era bodybuilding. And this course comes from the first series of York courses. This is in fact the first York barbell course. So this was initially published, I believe, in 1936. Again, obviously the date I'm working off for steroids was early 50s. And so we're talking a couple of decades before then. And the course, I've mentioned this in the past, that obviously when it comes to sets and reps, there's a bit of leeway there. Obviously sets weren't commonly used, or they were kind of beginning to be used. And generally speaking, and especially from a York barbell perspective, they were kind of pretty flexible with how one were to do that. So in this course, the initial instructions were to do 1 set of each of these exercises, and you would start with 6 repetitions. You would progress it to 12 or 10 or 12, depending on the exercise, and then you would add weight and come back down to 6. But they did acknowledge, and especially Hoffman did acknowledge, that if you were more advanced, you could certainly add a second set. He called it the heavy light method, where you would do like a set of 7, then you would rest. It wasn't like a long rest. You would rest like 30 to 60 seconds type thing. You would reduce a bit of weight, about 10% off the bar, and then you would do another set of 7 or so. So that was kind of, you had a bit of flexibility there on sets, but he did suggest everyone start just with this single set method first. So the first instruction given here is to start with a warming up exercise. Now, a common theme you do see with a lot of these lifters and these courses is they do actually suggest or emphasize how important it is to, in fact, be warm. Okay. Not even part of the warming up, but they say things like, wear tracksuit pants and a hoodie if it's cold, or, maybe go for a walk before you start lifting. Like, this is emphasis on actually you want the muscles to be warm. Okay. And then, assuming muscles are warm, what we're doing is starting with this warming up exercise. And essentially, what they describe here is you use an empty bar, and he specifically says having collars on a bar. I'm assuming that is like a spacer. I'm not exactly sure, but he says like you walk up to the bar on the floor, an empty bar on the floor, and you pick it up. Basically, he describes a deadlift position, and then he says you quickly, dynamically, you'll bring the bar up into that sort of hang position, and then you essentially do a snatch with it. So you bring the bar in front of you and then the bar overhead, and you finish in this overhead locked out position, and then you lower the bar again and you do this 12 times. So, and he's very clear that this is not a strength exercise. You are not trying to add weight. You're not trying to, make this sort of challenging in terms of load. He says this is an exercise to warm up your muscles. That is it, right? You do this 12 times, one set, and then you move into the workout. Now, the first exercise is a barbell curl. And again, we're doing this single set, 6 to 10 to 12. So barbell curl, then you go into a barbell overhead press. Then you go into what they call the deep knee bend on toes. So we're doing a heels elevated squat. Then we go into a 2-arm pullover. Now the pullover, I've talked about this in the past. Typically, they're doing this with slightly higher repetitions, and they're doing this a little bit away from failure. So they emphasize this like a light pullover. With this, they normally do like 10 to 20 repetitions. The idea here was you're breathing in really deeply, expanding the chest between the squats or after the squats. Then we go into a stiff leg deadlift, and then essentially what is a bench. So they call it a back press on a box or a bench, or a supine press, but essentially we're just talking a bench press. And then we've got side bend. So you have the barbell on your back like a squat, and you're doing side bends with it. Then we have the Jefferson lift, and then a standing calf raise. Now, after the standing calf raise, he has like a little kind of almost like a superset here. And it is I believe we've talked about this maybe in one plan in the past, what they call a straddle hop, which is a bit of a funny one to imagine. And it's not one that I don't see this talked about very often, and I haven't seen it make a recurrence since this time period. So I think it maybe fell out of favor. But what the straddle hop is essentially you're in the same position as you've just done the standing calf raise. You've got the barbell on your back using the same load, and then you have your feet together. You have your heels together. I think your toes maybe pointing out a little bit, and you essentially jump, spreading your feet. He says 24 inches to the sides. And then you jump, bringing your feet back together, and you repeat this as many times as you can. So it's an interesting exercise choice. And then we concluded with a barbell shoulder, like a vertical shrug. So we have 11 exercises, including the straddle hop, and 12 if we include the warming up exercise. Over to you, Chris. What do you see? What's your take on that?
What do I see? I imagine that most people who have been following that list of exercises through are not going to be surprised by what I now say, because I think it's relatively straightforward to see some of the positives and negatives in that list. Interestingly, in previous episodes where we've analysed these programs, we've noticed that deadlift was surprisingly absent. We didn't feel like there was much use of a deadlift, despite the fact that it's quite an obvious thing to do if you don't have lots of equipment and you're in that kind of territory where you've got a barbell on the floor and you've got to do something with it. And the obvious thing to do is to pick it up. I mean, that would be the deadlift. We've got 2 deadlift variations here. We've got a stiff leg, and we've got the Jefferson. So that's really, really interesting that we've got that usage of deadlifts in this program. And of course, stiff leg again solves one of the problems that I've argued before about some of these silver era routines, which is that hamstrings don't tend to get very much attention. And clearly here we've got a stiff leg deadlift, which is not the most amazing exercise for the hamstrings, but it's definitely better than nothing, which is kind of one of the problems that we do tend to see with these routines. So that's what I would say is definitely a positive. Again, kind of looking at negatives, as I always comment, there's very little lat work here. There's very little back work here. So apart from the deadlift variations, which are obviously going to give you some back stimulus, there's no pulling exercises of any kind, really. There's no row and there's no lat pull down, and as I've mentioned before, those are not difficult exercises to do with minimal equipment. You can do rows relatively easily, and you can do pull-ups relatively easily. So I don't know why we wouldn't have those. It makes very little sense to me to ignore them, especially when you're throwing in things like, kind of whatever that straddle hop thing is, and sort of side bends. I mean, come on, if you've got space in your program to do stuff like that, you've got space in your program to do pull-ups and rows. I mean, come on, let's be
A note
serious.
on the side bends, because like I said, this is very early. This is 1936, right? And what I do notice with side bends is they do get left behind. So I don't know if people remember our first course we talked about, the Milo barbell course. So that was like 1901 or something when that was published, 1910, very early on. They were using things like side bends. And then we still see them here present in the 30s. But then once we get to like the 40s and 50s, most people have left them behind.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of those interesting things where people observe the effects of exercises and they notice that it doesn't seem to be doing anything positive, and it gets dropped. And I think that's a nice thing about reading up on this and researching this Silver Era material, is because you can be relatively confident that those guys were noticing things and it was meaningful observations. Of course, now when everybody's growing all the time because of anabolics, you can't really make those observations. It's like, well, everything's growing, so what's working? I don't know. It's nice to have that ability to, you know, notice when things are working. So that would really be only my only observations. Really, I don't have anything particularly exciting. It's nice. Again, we've got both bench presses and overhead presses. I mean, obviously we've talked about this, and you've explained how aesthetics changed over time. And in the earliest programs, you didn't tend to get bench pressing because there's no real chest emphasis at all. As aesthetics changed and but we had more shoulder work in the beginning. And now we've got less shoulder work direct, and we've got the bench press in its place. So again, just repeating what we said before.
One other thing I want to highlight here is the exercise order. I don't know if you'll agree with me on this, but if we look at, so we starting with a curl. Like a lot of these plans start with a curl. And often I hear people say, well, why would you do that? Wouldn't you put that last? Or, doesn't it make more sense to do that? And, normally people say after back. And as you pointed out, there's not a lot of back here. But we go from a curl to an overhead press. Now, obviously the overhead press, you're going to be using more weight than the curl, I would assume. And then we go into the squat, which again is going to really be more weight. They do say you start with the load that you use for your overhead, right? But then obviously you're going to progress at different paces. And then the stiff leg, which again, you start at a similar weight, but I assume they're probably going to be able to use more load there as well. And then it's almost like we reset. So then we kind of go back to the bench. We'll go low end weight again, then to the Jefferson lift or side exercise, the Jefferson lift, and then the shrug. And there's almost like generally this ascending kind of load that'll be used throughout the workout. And in the context of warming up and understanding that apart from this dynamic exercise I was doing at the start, this Olympic lift, there's no other real warm up. I wonder if that exercise selection in some ways maybe was intentional around that. Like A, the fact that you're using lighter loads, B, that we're going from an overhead press into a bench later on, or we're going from a squat into the stiff leg deadlift. Like I wonder if that ordering or that sequence kind of helps that. Like if you were to start with a stiff leg deadlift and then go into a squat, like would that be a lot more challenging or uncomfortable in this context where you're not warming up than if you were to start with curls and overhead and etc.
I was wondering about whether there might be an element of practicality because, and it doesn't look like it works perfectly at all, but you could imagine a scenario where if you're a relatively sort of strong guy and you've got one barbell and you want to do a whole sequence of exercises, you don't really want to be doing, I mean, for example, you don't want to be doing biceps curls and then deadlifts and then going back to, I don't know, something, equally light. So you kind of spending your life putting plates on and off the barbell. Whereas if you have something like biceps curls and then overhead press, you're putting some plates on, but not a lot. And then you go from the overhead press to the squat, you're going to put a whole load of other plates on top of that. I can kind of see maybe there's a sort of, and it breaks down after that. The pattern doesn't really
Yeah.
work, but I can kind of see a scenario in which you might plan your workout, not necessarily around, ideal exercise order like we might do. We might walk into a gym and go, oh, well, I can do that exercise on that machine and I can walk over there and do that on that. And it's all selectorized and I don't have to carry plates around. Whereas they're in a different situation. They've got these limitations on them that are actually practical. So maybe there's a little bit of that there. And as I say, it doesn't work perfectly at all after you get to the squat exercise. After that, it kind of messes around a little bit. you can kind of see a scenario where you might have a requirement to, move from exercises that use less weight to those that use more weight and then come back down again.
Mm.
Now, I would reorder the exercises here if I was genuinely doing that, but it does kind of strike me, definitely those first 3 exercises do
Yeah.
strike me as potentially a sequential order of using more and more weight from one exercise to the next. Other than that, I'm not really seeing anything obvious that I would kind of point to.
What's your take on that warming up exercise?
So obviously Hoffman was a Olympic coach, so he's gonna, kind of naturally sort of choose something that is basically an Olympic lifting warm-up, or part of one. So I'm not surprised that he's got that there. The question is, what, does it really do in the context of somebody who's not then doing Olympic lifts, as part of their routine? There's no Olympic lifts in this. There's bits of exercises that you could say are close to Olympic lifts. You've got shrug in there, you've got sort of squat in there, you've got deadlift in there. There's little bits that you could kind of say are kind of close, but they're not really requiring the kind of shoulder mobility, genuine whole body movement patterns that you would actually see in an Olympic weightlifting exercise. I did actually wonder when you were describing the straddle hop whether there might be some element of Olympic lifting in there, but it's not really going in the right direction. But it does have that same kind of feel to it. But ultimately, I think probably what we're seeing there is Hoffman's Olympic weightlifting background coming through in the kind of peripheral aspects of the workout. I think that's probably all it is.
With this straddle hop, there's nothing that comes to mind for you as to what that would be achieving. No.
Not at all, no.
It is definitely a funny one. I've not seen anyone in the gym performing that. Okay, so the warming up exercise, let's move on to what is it we are trying to achieve in a warm-up?
I think that's a really, really good question. So I might not be able to answer that immediately in terms of what we can achieve. I think that what people are believing they're achieving is one of 2 things. It's going to either be that they are somehow enhancing the stimuli that the workout is capable of achieving, and secondly, it's going to be that they're reducing the likelihood of injury risk could occur in the workout that they're about to do. So it's going to be one of those 2 things or both of them. So ultimately, what we want to answer then is what kind of warm-up might enable us to achieve those things, and what do we need to know physiologically to be able to answer that question? So really, I think what we can do is identify 2 separate categories of physiological information that sit under those 2 headings. So we've got the performance improvements leading to improved stimuli, and then secondly, we've got the injury risk reduction. And under those 2 headings, we can look at the warming up temperature-wise of a muscle, and separately we can look at post-activation potentiation and other potentiation mechanisms, and we can look at those under each of those 2 headings of stimuli and injury prevention. So if we start with the warming up temperature, what we're saying here is basically that if you physically warm a muscle up, now conventionally, this is done with low intensity aerobic exercise. So if you do 15 to 20 minutes of low intensity aerobic exercise, then the muscle that you're using, so if you're on a treadmill, it's the legs. If you're on, kind of sort of a bike that has handles to move that you can use the whole body, then obviously you'll use more muscles of the upper body as well as the lower body. But fundamentally, the muscles you're using in the aerobic exercise will warm up. And what you'll notice is that temperature increase has an impact on the workout that you're about to do in terms of performance characteristics. So the interesting thing is you can mimic that by literally just putting the muscle that you're testing in a bath of warm water. So if you're going to do quadriceps testing, you can literally have somebody sit in a bath of warm water, and it will actually mimic the effect I'm about to describe from low intensity aerobic exercise. So what happens is that the performance measures like 1-rep maxes or for example, high velocity performance, for example, you might test throwing ability or something like that. They tend to increase quite noticeably. Now, the interesting thing is the reason this happens is very well described. What happens is that the actin and myosin cross bridges are essentially dependent on a temperature dependent supply of energy. So if you are looking to create cross bridges relatively rapidly, you can do that more effectively, you can do that more quickly if you have a higher temperature of the muscle. If you start to sort of cool the muscle down, what you'll notice is that the rate of cross bridge formations slows down. Now, interestingly, if you live in a cold country and you go outside and you forget your gloves, you'll notice this straight away, because what will happen is your hands will actually not be able to move anywhere near as quickly as they would do inside a warm building. it actually doesn't change your grip strength that much. It actually changes the speed of shortening because it's mimicking essentially what metabolite-related fatigue does. It slows you down because it slows down the rate of cross-bridge formations. Obviously, the opposite, warming the muscle with either a aerobic exercise or a warm water, will actually do the opposite and actually increase the rate of cross-bridge formations. Now, the question is then, answering the first question, does that change the stimuli for the workout in the workout that we're going to do? Well, it depends on what you're trying to stimulate to happen. If you want to trigger, for example, adaptations relating to high velocity movement. So let's say you're interested in triggering a speed related adaptation. You're an athlete or you're coaching athletes and you want the athlete to develop some speed related adaptations like increased firing rates or increased muscle fiber shortening velocities, those kind of things. You'll notice actually that increasing muscle temperature helps you create the stimuli or a bigger stimuli for those adaptations. What is the fundamental characteristic that enables us to trigger an increase in rate coding in motor unit firing frequencies? Well, it's actually achieving a high firing frequency. Well, how do we do that? Well, we move as fast as we possibly can. If temperature increasing allows us to move faster, then you'll actually hit a higher firing frequency and actually trigger an adaptation to a greater extent. The same thing will happen with muscle fiber shortening velocity. And you can kind of start to see that the temperature related the sort of increase in muscle temperature actually is helping us trigger a bigger stimulus in those particular contexts. But if you were to say, well, okay, well, does that help me trigger a bigger hypertrophy stimulus? Well, no, it doesn't. It doesn't. Physiologically, it almost certainly doesn't. Now, the reason I say that is because if you look at what happens when you have a higher muscle temperature, you create more cross bridges more quickly. That's why we get the faster shortening velocity. That's why we get the faster rate coding as a result of the faster shortening velocity. If you are triggering more cross bridges per second, you'll develop more metabolite related fatigue. So you'll actually hit failure earlier. So the thing is, you end up with the same dosage of total mechanical tension across your set because you're just producing cross bridges more quickly, assuming you want to do that. You may not actually do that because you may not actually want to do that. So you may actually just carry on using the same tempo as you're using before. But fundamentally, you can't actually change the mechanical tension stimulus by doing that because you just create more metabolite related fatigue.
So from a hypertrophy perspective, it would be the equivalent to if you were to say reverse and an exercise to make the resistance profile more flat as opposed to...
That's exactly what you would be doing. You would basically be creating more, instead of having a very steep resistance profile and you're just kind of using a load of cross bridges of high threshold motor unit muscle fibers and one part of the range of motion. What you're doing now is you're creating a larger range of motion where those cross bridges are required to form, flattening the resistance profile. And so what ends up happening is that you just end up failing earlier because the experience of each repetition is now harder. You're doing the same thing. So ultimately, you create the same stimulus at the end of the set as you would do if you hadn't done the warm-up. So the interesting thing is that increased muscle temperature is actually really interesting from an athletic point of view, especially on the speed end of the spectrum. It really does help that kind of adaptation. Less so on the strength end, but maybe you can make an argument for being able to use slightly more weight and that greater weight maybe having a tendon-related effect or a costomer-related effect. It's a very thin argument in comparison with the speed-related adaptations, which I think is a relatively solid one.
Would there be an impact on coordination?
So coordination obviously is velocity specific. So if you move faster, you're going to have a better chance at practicing with a faster speed. It's going to mostly again be at the speed end of the spectrum. I think the thing is, warming up prior to a workout is so clearly beneficial for speed related adaptations. It's not actually as clearly obviously better for strength related adaptations, and it's pretty much clearly not going to help from a hypertrophy point of view. So for people who are listening to this and are literally only interested in bodybuilding, which is, I guess, a large portion of our sort of listening public, warm-ups are not going to help you trigger a larger hypertrophy stimulus, I don't believe, because it's just going to create... The reality is people who are using a fixed tempo or a self-selected kind of non-maximal tempo, they're not even going to be using the benefit that the warm-up gives them. Because the cross bridges are not going to form faster because they're just going to form at the speed that you tell them to form. So all that's going to happen is that you're going to, use the same amount of hypertrophy, create the same amount of hypertrophy stimulus with the available cross bridges that you've got.
So you shouldn't notice an impact on, say, total repetitions in a sense.
I don't believe that you would see one, no. I don't believe
so
that
even... Because in my head, I'm wondering whether people would be thinking, well, is that going to influence measuring or tracking progressive overload if sometimes I'm warmed up and sometimes I'm not?
Well, that brings us to the next physiological observation. So that was muscle temperature. How does muscle temperature affect, kind of the stimuli for given adaptations? And what I've argued there is that I think it dramatically affects the possibility to trigger speed-related adaptations. And I've mentioned things like firing rate and muscle fiber shortening velocity. And you've also brought up the coordination factor, which again is definitely a possibility. The other category of physiologically relevant mechanisms are the post-activation potentiation, or just generally potentiation mechanisms. So there are two kind of potentiation mechanisms that we would want to talk about here. One of these is the post-activation potentiation effect, PAP effect, and the other is the post-activation performance enhancement effect, PAPE effect. So we refer to those as PAP and PAPE. There's a section of my FAQ that explains why that happened. It's basically a historical issue. We actually originally referred to all temporary potentiation mechanisms as PAP effects. We've now separated PAP and PAPE off because PAP has a very clear physiological explanation for it. PAPE doesn't. The PAP effect is a kind of a 1 to 5 minute effect whereby you essentially get an instantaneous increase in force production across the entire force velocity spectrum as a result of the actin and myosin cross bridges moving closer. Sorry, not the cross bridges. Actin and myosin themselves move closer to each other. So you end up forming cross bridges more rapidly. Now, the interesting thing here is that that probably does increase performance even on a repetition strength issue. So if you're, obviously moving the myosin closer to actin will give you a higher warm-up max. It'll give you a higher maximal kind of throwing speed and things like that, as I say, across the whole force velocity spectrum. It probably also increases rep strength. Now, the reason I say that is because we are increasing the efficiency of the cross bridge formation. We're not doing what I was talking about previously. We're creating more cross bridges per second. We are essentially increasing the efficiency of the contraction. So I think we probably would see a repetition strength. Now, I honestly don't know if that has been tested. So I'm going to kind of be cautious about saying that that's definitively going to happen. But I think that would be a potential way in which you would see an increase in, as you say, progressive overload. But definitively, we are going to see strength increases, and we are going to see velocity increases. Now, how do you create a PAP effect? You create a PAP effect basically by activating the muscle fiber for a very short period of time. Now, why I say very short period of time is because we have got data showing you can get PAP effects from like high velocity movements. So one of the most interesting practical applications of PAP effects is where you actually get somebody to do a maximal effort vertical jump, maybe 30 seconds to a minute before they do a set of squats, heavy squats. And you will actually notice an improvement in things like bar speed in that scenario, and maybe even things like a 3 rep or 1 rep max. So some people have said, PAP effects need a certain period of time. Doesn't look like that. PAP effects look like they happen instantaneously as soon as you activate the relevant muscle fibers. So in practical terms, if you want to create a PAP effect because you're training an athlete that's doing fast for speed-related adaptations, for example, or even strength-related adaptations, because you will get a heavier load out of them if you can get the PAP effect implemented, you actually only need to do a single fast velocity repetition and you've created the PAP effect. You don't need to do anything other than that. So it's actually very, very easy and simple thing to achieve. So in practical terms, if somebody wants that for a set of like hypertrophy type repetitions, they're doing bodybuilding, you're going to need to slightly reconstruct the way that you think about warm-ups, because if you're doing, say, a set of repetitions to warm up and you're not doing any maximal efforts at any point, which is pretty normal. Most people aren't going to do a maximal effort in the warm-up before they do a set of, a set to failure. You are probably going to need to think about doing a single high effort repetition, even if that's with a lighter load, to get that PAP effect if you want to do that. Whether or not this does change the hypertrophy stimulus is really quite difficult to assess. Honestly, don't know. I wouldn't want to come down hard on either side of the debate here, really, at the moment. If it does change efficiency, maybe it does change the magnitude of the mechanical tension stimulus on the set. But honestly, I really wouldn't want to be committed to one side of the argument at this point. I think it's going to be interesting to see if people do more work on this and whether it turns out to be a relevant factor. But at the moment, I don't want to be too committed either way.
So the key part there is effort. So it doesn't need to be a low weight or a vertical jump or something like that. It could actually just be a load that was like a 5 rep max or heavier, and you could do a single repetition with that.
It can be absolutely any load at all. The problem you're going to have is that if you're trying to say, for example, you've worked your way through a set of warm-up repetitions, however you normally do them, and you're now trying to integrate this concept into your routine, you could pick any load you like, and as long as the effort level is high so that the recruitment is high, you'll get the effect. The problem is that if you pick a really heavy load, like for example, if you're planning to do 5-6 rep max as your work set, and you think, oh, I'll just do a single before I do that, that's actually going to create quite a lot of fatigue because the duration of the rep is going to be quite slow, and you're giving a lot of time for metabolites to accumulate and calcium ions to accumulate. If you just drop the weight down slightly so that you can do the rep and it's over with and done, it's like a 10 rep max or 12 rep max and it's pop and you've done it, you're not going to get that same problem, but you are still going to get the benefits.
Yeah. So that would involve someone being very intentional about doing it. You need to perform a max effort, right? So what I like about, say, if you were to use a heavy load, say you do use a 5 rep max, you do a single, and then you would presumably you'd want to rest a full rest period before doing your working set. Even if you're not intentionally doing that effort, that rep with a high effort, like it is happening by default. Whereas if you use a 10 rep max, then what you're saying there, like you need to intentionally be as fast as possible and not concentric, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think ultimately this is starting to move into practical territory where we're trying to sort of think about how to make it work. But ultimately, the key physiological trigger is just achieving a activation of the relevant muscle fibers. So yeah, we can do that with any load you like. You just have to use max effort. The only then questions that follow up after that are, is this practical? Do I create fatigue at the same time? And that kind of stuff. But fundamentally, physiologically, it's just activating the fibers.
So in the warming up exercise we described at the start, presumably that would have had a PAP effect on some muscles or some muscle fibers then.
Yeah, but it's only going to last for about 5 minutes max. You're not going to get an effect lasting any longer than that. So that's why I say one of the most interesting ways of using it in an athletic context is to do a single fast repetition, like a jump or a throw, prior to doing a heavy strength training exercise. That's a really nice way of doing it. But ultimately, you're only going to keep that effect for those couple of minutes before it dies away.
There's a bit of debate happening online at the moment with this topic as to whether a unloaded, I don't know what you would call it, where you basically do the exercise, you do a repetition unloaded. So say you're doing a bicep curl without any bar, you're literally just performing the motion of a biceps curl and as fast as possible. And the question, and just a single repetition. And so there's debate over would that cause a PAP effect or not?
Yeah, I think it probably would. I mean, ultimately, there's the question over, are you capable of moving genuinely as fast as you possibly can when you've got to immediately start decelerating the moment you start the movement? Because when you do a movement like that, and I mean, the thing about a jump is that you leave the ground, so you don't need to
Yep.
worry about the end of the movement.
Yep.
If you're talking about something like a biceps curl, you don't really want to finish the biceps curl in a way that you finish a jump, where you literally just allow it to finish on its own, because that's dangerous. So you're going to start immediately decelerating as soon as you accelerate. So the question is, do you actually get to max speed in those single joint scenarios? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. But fundamentally, physiologically, yes, a fast repetition, if you do achieve max effort, is enough. That literally there are studies showing that for both upper body and lower body. It's not controversial. So in terms of hypertrophy, yeah, I'm not entirely sure whether it does actually benefit us or not. It really comes down to, are you getting a higher dosage of mechanical tension across the set by the movement of myosin closer to actin? And that comes down to, is it actually an efficiency modifier, or is it just allowing you to produce more cross bridges in at the same period of time? If it's a genuine efficiency modifier, you're actually doing something that's changing the efficiency of that connection. Yes, it will create a bigger mechanical tension stimulus. If it's just allowing you to move more cross bridges in the same period of time, then no, it won't, because you'll just get more metabolite-related fatigue, and therefore you'll end up in the same place as you would do if you're warming up with temperature increase that we talked about previously. And I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know whether it is an efficiency modifier.
I do have one more question on this. So if you were to do multiple sets, then let's say your first set was into failure. Let's say you do 2 sets of 8 to 10 repetitions. In your first set, you keep 2 reps in reserve, and then your second set, you go to failure. Presumably that first set has produced a PAP effect for your second set, yes? But then the second question then is, why in a single set, say you do 10 repetitions, why does repetition 6 not produce a PAP effect for repetition 7 onwards?
It probably does. It probably does. I mean, the thing is, most of these PAP effect studies have been done with relatively small numbers of repetitions. They're testing 1 rep maxes, they're testing, kind of jump heights, kind of short distance sprint speeds, that kind of thing. So the chances are that we do get a PAP effect towards the back end of the set. So it really is probably just affecting the kind of early repetitions, not really affecting much after that. So again, the question arises is it even worth worrying about, really? Tricky question.
Okay, so far we're landing at a place where, from a hypertrophy perspective, it's questionable whether warming up so far is providing much of a benefit.
Absolutely. I mean, the only other mechanism that we've got to describe is the PAPE effect. So we've described the PAP effect, now the PAPE effect. And unfortunately here, we just don't know what's going on at all. So in contrast to the PAP effect, where we've got a very, very well described physiological mechanism, which is this moving of myosin closer to actin, that is extremely well described. We know more or less, we know how it works. In contrast, the PAPE effect is completely unknown. We don't know the underlying mechanism. We've got some data that has enabled us to rule out certain factors. It looks like you can read reviews on this stuff and people will talk around it and describe all the possibilities. But the reality is we've got data showing that the PAPE effect is later in time. So it kind of lasts longer than the PAP effect, up to about maybe even 15 minutes. And in that period of time, we've got data showing that you can produce a PAPE effect, a potentiation effect, even in the presence of supraspinal CNS fatigue. So that's really important because one of the most common kind of claims on the internet is that warm-ups are about increasing the activation of the central nervous system. No, they're not. We know that they're not because the PAP effect has got nothing to do with the central nervous system, and the PAPE effect happens in the presence of supraspinal CNS fatigue. So again, showing that it's not being generated by the central nervous system. So when people say, we're doing potentiation activation exercises to get the CNS to do something different, that's not what's happening. We can rule out the CNS being the factor that's changing. We can also rule out the muscle temperature being the factor because PAPE effects are actually triggered by things that don't warm the muscle up. Yes, you can read reviews and they'll go, maybe muscle temperature changes are a factor. No, they're not, because you can literally create a PAPE effect in like a couple of seconds. You can't warm a muscle up in a couple of seconds. It doesn't work like that. So it's very mysterious, very, very mysterious what's going on with this PAPE effect, but it's probably local. And until somebody figures out whether it's affecting the mechanical tension stimulus locally, we're not going to know whether it's something that's helpful for hypertrophy. Ultimately, that's kind of where we are. We're stuck really until somebody does some more work on this. This is one of those things that's like delayed onset muscle soreness. I don't have an explanation that I think people just sort of assume that I've got an explanation for everything. I don't. There's things that I don't have enough data for to be able to pull a model together. And PAPE effect is one of those things I don't have enough data for. I'd love to have more data for it because it's a really interesting phenomenon. And if it does affect the hypertrophy stimulus, it would actually change things very slightly because you might want to try and sort of judge your rest period, not just based on the fatiguing problems, but also on catching the wave of your PAPE effect. And that would mean you'd actually take quite a lot longer rests because PAPE effect tends to peak around 8 minutes or so very, very approximately. So instead of kind of going down the route of saying, well, we'd use a rest period geared around letting supraspinal CNS fatigue dissipate, which is my current recommendation, we might actually shift things and say, well, actually, let's surf the wave of the PAPE effect. Now, that would then push you towards maybe thinking about antagonist supersets or something like that, so that you could actually catch these kind of waves of PAPE effect in sequential exercises so there's some really, really interesting implications of this being a thing. And that's one of the reasons why I don't want to claim it's a thing until I know it's a thing, because this actually has pretty profound implications for how you might structure a strength training program. And so let me reiterate that I do not know yet whether or not the PAPE effect does change the mechanical tension stimulus. I don't know the answer to that question, so I'm not going to kind of suggest that anybody programs on that basis. So what we can now do is we can say, of these 3 things that we've described, muscle temperature changes, kind of with generic warm-ups, PAP effects and PAPE effects, does any of that stuff change injury prevention? Sorry, does any of that stuff change injury risk? And is it therefore worth doing from an injury prevention point of view? So on this, what I can point to very clearly is that increased muscle temperature does reduce the risk of muscle strain injury. What it does is it actually requires more kinetic energy to be generated in order to actually reach a certain muscle length. So muscle strain injuries we can talk about in more detail at another time, but fundamentally what happens is that when you stretch a muscle to a certain length, it tends to tear. And if you have a muscle that's capable of producing more force, then you'll have to put in more kinetic energy to get to the tearing length. So things like increased muscle temperature have been shown to actually be quite beneficial for reducing muscle strain injury risk. So we could also hypothesize that PAP effects and PAPE effects would be similarly effective because they're increasing the capacity of the muscle to produce force and therefore increasing its ability to resist being lengthened to a tearing length. Now, it's complicated to explain why that tearing length can be reached in a strength training situation, but I can cover that in potentially a future conversation. But essentially, when we do lots of kind of muscle damaging exercise, you can actually reduce the tearing length to the point where it does occur inside of a exercise range of motion. So essentially, summarizing, muscle temperature definitely does reduce the risk of strain injury by making it harder for the muscle to get to the tearing length, and we could therefore suppose, and not been tested, but we could suppose that both PAP and PAPE effects would do the same thing. So essentially, I think there's a lot stronger argument for the purpose of a warm-up being for injury risk reduction than there is for it producing an increase in hypertrophy stimulus. I think that's very weak. In contrast, I do think it's quite strong for speed-related adaptations. So athletes who are training for high-performance sport and high-velocity movements, I think that warm-ups will work both for the stimulus being increased for those adaptations that relate to speed, as well as injury prevention. And I think that probably is the group of people I would say warm-ups are most important for you guys. For hypertrophy training, I think really, unless it turns out that post-activated potentiation or PAPE, either PAP or PAPE, are capable of increasing the mechanical tension stimulus, I'm very skeptical. Very skeptical is probably a bit harsh. I am uncertain about whether that is a thing. I think it's much more going to be on the injury prevention side that we would do warm-ups for hypertrophy training.
So there's so many different ways people do warm-ups, and there's obviously so much debate about, how should they be done? Obviously, what are they doing, which you've covered so far. I want to cover as many of those questions as possible. Is there anything else you want to talk about theoretically before we jump into some of the application?
No, I think we've covered everything there in terms of the physiology. As I've hopefully relayed it out, we've just got these three physiological things. We've got the temperature of the muscle, we've got the PAP, the post-activation potentiation effect, we've got the PAPE, the post-activation performance enhancement effect, and we can look at those under the headings of both, kind of stimuli for specific adaptations, hypertrophy being the one that we're interested in most, and then secondly, we can look at it from an injury prevention point of view. So with that matrix, I think we've kind of covered everything that I wanted to say.
Great. So I'm going to try to, I guess, verbalize maybe some of the questions people might have in their mind as listening to this, and some of the questions I get a lot about warm-ups. And one of them would be, and this maybe ties into a little bit with the injury prevention, I'm not sure. But another reason I guess people might think about warm-ups is they might think, well, if I don't warm up, I'm going to be stiff, my joints are going to ache, I pick up a heavy load and suddenly I feel like I'm going to break apart. What is it that you've talked about there that would be helping with some of that sort of sensation?
Obviously, I'm not a physio, I'm not a doctor, I don't really know anything about that kind of stuff. I understand that exercise has a pain relieving effect, so maybe there's something going on there, but I don't know enough to comment intelligently. I think that's one of those questions that you kind of got to ask a physio, really.
So then in the context of, say, a squat, so say someone's doing a heavy squat and they don't warm up and they pick up a 5-rep max and they perform that squat and they barely complete it, they feel weak, they feel like they're going to tumble over. Is there anything sort of happening there that you can comment on as to why maybe someone might feel weaker in a heavy lift like that without warming up?
So obviously we described how the kind of temperature related factor and the PAP and the PAPE effects could all increase instantaneous strength. So essentially that would be one of the sort of underlying physiological reasons for that. You might also have psychological reasons for it. It might just be extremely scary. And of course, when we talk about, motor unit recruitment, we've always got this model of the psychobiological model of fatigue. If you're dealing with emotions while you're trying to do an exercise, you've got less capacity to produce motor unit recruitment because some of your perception of effort capacity is being devoted towards dealing with those emotions. So if you're scared or you're feeling wobbly or any of those things that are uncomfortable, discomforting sensations, you are going to be reducing your capacity to produce central motor command as a result of feeling those things. So it's kind of almost a self-fulfilling prophecy, I think, in some ways. Coordination-wise, is it something that is, does it help us to work up a series of loads to get to our particular weight? I think it probably does. But again, that's outside of my remit as well, because you're now starting to go into motor learning territory. And interestingly, that body of literature is absolutely gigantic. So, you'd want to ask somebody who specialized in motor learning and say to them, look, if I'm trying to do a really complex, difficult, heavy, high effort task, does it help me to work up a series of steps to get to that load before actually doing the test weight? If so, why does that happen? And maybe they'd have an answer, or maybe they wouldn't. I don't know. I suspect they probably wouldn't. I don't think it's the kind of motor learning task that gets studied. But yeah, that would be definitely something worth thinking.
I feel like it would be more likely because I'm trying to differentiate here. Is it load or is it the complexity of the movement and the skill specificity? And
well, I
I
think
would
you could
assume,
test that by just asking yourself, how long does it take you to warm up for something like a leg press where you've got the ability
yeah, exactly.
to, compared with a squat? My experience is that it takes probably about 5 times as long to warm up for a squat than it does to warm up for a leg press. So I think it's the combination of the load and the complexity and the difficulty of the movement. Incidentally, I find it a lot faster to warm up for a deadlift than I do for a squat. And I suspect that again is because the squat is just so much more capable of hurting you if it goes wrong. Maybe that's a bit of a kind of a generic statement, but because people do get hurt doing deadlifts. But the barbell is maybe that's not the right way to perceive it. Maybe it's the fact that when we do a squat, we're balancing a barbell on our back, and that is fundamentally perceived as more threatening by the brain. Even though maybe people would say, "Oh no, people get damaged, people get hurt doing deadlifts much more often than they get hurt doing squats." Maybe that's true. But the brain doesn't see it that way. Because you can just drop the barbell at any point. As far as the brain is concerned, that's an exit strategy. Whereas a squat, you can't do that. So maybe the brain perceives the squat as more terrifying. I don't know.
You've talked about warming up the muscle, that being muscle specific, and talked about like aerobic exercise helping achieve that. Can one achieve that through doing like the actual exercises of the workout as opposed to doing aerobic exercise?
Well, that's not really a question, because from a physiological point of view, if you drop the weight lower than the threshold at which the muscle is hitting vascular occlusion, you're doing aerobic exercise.
Yep. Okay. So let's say, I guess what I'm trying to get at here is if you look at the standard way people are warming up, right? I'd say most commonly people are probably going to do, let's say 2 to 3 warm-up sets. They'll probably do the first set with empty bar, basically no load. Then they'll do a second set with maybe, let's say, 50% of the working weight. And then they might do a third set with, 70% of the working weight. And maybe they're doing 8 repetitions each set, there, give or take, right? I look at that and I think, well, you probably haven't achieved the PAP effect, right? You haven't probably done
Probably
max
haven't
effort.
achieved the muscle temperature effect either. And this is a really interesting point, because the reality is that most common approaches to warming up don't achieve anything.
No, that's what it
Apart
sounds like.
from perhaps a feeling of, what's the right word, comfort with the exercise. And actually, I don't think that's unimportant. I think
That's what we were just
actually,
talking about with the
it's
squat.
what we were just talking about with the squat. It's like if you're uncomfortable because you've jumped too far up to the work weight, then yes, you're going to have worrying sensations that are going to, kind of stop you from achieving high levels of recruitment. So yes, that's an issue. But fundamentally, if we go back to the starting kind of physiological issues, muscle temperature, PAP and PAPE, no, most warm-ups are not achieving any of those things.
Yeah, so presumably they're just affecting perception of effort, or that would be the main.
Just affecting comfort with the exercise that they're going to do. And that degree of comfort, as we've just been exploring, is probably more related to the way in which the brain perceives the exercise. You're doing like sort of knee extensions or leg curls or, kind of something on a machine that's relatively stable, you probably aren't going to be feeling particularly nervous about the exercise with your work weight, at least not after you've done a couple of reps with a meaningful weight.
So to go back to muscle temperature then, how much exercise, how much aerobic exercise must one do to achieve that muscle warming effect?
So you're looking at about 15 minutes really, and it's, as we've said, it's muscle specific. So, realistically, even when people do their kind of treadmill walks before they do their exercise, most people aren't getting anything for the upper body that's even remotely close to what they would need to achieve. So, I think interestingly, and again, just to come back to something we talked about, we're talking about this from an injury prevention point of view. We're not really talking about needing to, unless you're a kind of athlete competing in a fast movement sport, you're not really going to need to do this for performance. For stimuli related factors. You're literally just talking about doing it from an injury prevention point of view. But yeah, most people who perhaps go in the gym to do a upper body workout or a workout with upper body exercises in it are probably going to be not getting the injury prevention benefits of a warm up from anything that they're doing.
Now, a question I've thought about before, and I don't know what I feel about this because I can see it could go either way, would be what about a short sauna before a training session?
Exactly. I mean, that's going to get you the muscle temperature potentially. I mean, again, this is not something I particularly looked at, but if you look at the sauna literature and you discover that it does raise muscle temperature, I guess it probably does. Then, you could argue that that would be valid. I don't know how. Again, I'm literally don't know what dosages and temperatures or anything would be relevant. All I can do is point to the literature that I've looked at, which is that warm baths do tend to have that effect. So.
How
I
long do
mean,
they have the bath for to have that effect?
I would have to go and look. I don't know.
Okay.
But I don't think it's ridiculous amount of time.
So if someone was listening to this and they've been like, oh man, I've been doing the 2 to 3 sets of 8 reps lightweight and sounds like I'm not doing a whole lot out of that. If they wanted to level up their warm up, I guess we've covered a couple of things there. You could do the muscle temperature thing using a exercise that was hopefully doing that for the muscles you're going to use in that workout. What are some other ways they could potentially level up their warm up?
So leaving aside, doing a muscle temperature warming kind of practice, whether that's most likely some kind of aerobic exercise that involves the muscles you're going to train with. Obviously, you can keep the muscle warm after that by using tracksuit or something like that, or you maybe depending on what environment you're working out in. But leaving aside that, it's really just the post-activation potentiation effect at the moment, which is, essentially going to be generated by single max effort repetitions. So really, what I would suggest is that once you've done your kind of sequence of set increments that you want to do to get you to your work weight, you drop the weight down slightly and do a sort of single max effort repetition or a high effort repetition, and that'll basically do it. In the context of barbell exercises, I would not do that. In the context of barbell exercises like bench press and squat and deadlift, I would do a totally different exercise. So I would do like a max effort vertical jump for the squat and do something like a medicine ball throw for the bench press, and deadlift you might do a kettlebell swing or something like that. So because there's just literally no point in starting to mess around with the barbell weight to do single effort repetitions in that situation. It doesn't work. So but for machines and other kind of exercises that are much more controlled, then you can do that single effort.
Something that what you've just said there that makes apparent is there's actually no necessity to do the actual exercise for your warm up.
No,
Like
it's
based on
muscle
any of these.
specific. I mean, of course, all of this is muscle specific. The muscle temperature is muscle specific. It's not
Yeah.
exercise specific. The PAP and the PAPE effects are muscle specific. They're localized effects. They've got nothing to do with the brain, really.
Yeah. So except for that sort of confidence rehearsal thing we were talking about with the squat,
Sure.
apart from that, then you don't theoretically need to do that exercise for warming up.
No, which is one of those interesting points that you've raised in conversation with me before, and I'm going to steal your thunder shamelessly, which is that if you do a sequence of different exercises for the same muscle, then potentially warming up across those 3 different exercises is not necessary. You could actually go from one to the other.
Yeah. And that's a criticism I hear a lot of full body plans, where people will be like, I couldn't possibly do that. You need to warm up so much. How could you do 20 different exercises? You'll need to do 60 sets. And like you've just said there, well, actually, maybe one thing you could do if you're doing, say, 2 or 3 exercises per muscle is that first exercise. And the way I would normally do it myself is I would do a couple of warm up sets for that first exercise. And generally, I either don't need any for those late exercises, or I will just do one with a light weight, just make sure everything feels good, and then go. So it doesn't need to actually be more time consuming than if you were to do multiple sets of one exercise.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think really what's happened is that people have looked at things like squats where you need 25 minutes to warm up to your work weight if you're doing heavy loads. And they've kind of extrapolated that and said we need to do that same practice for biceps curls or, kind of machine overhead presses and stuff like that. And it's almost certainly not true. Partly because, as I've described, we're not really getting any of the injury prevention mechanisms from the things that we're doing, in the squat sort of warm up. Those are confidence and movement related practice things that are essential, but they're not actually doing the muscle strain injury prevention thing that we've been describing. Maybe you could argue that they are actually doing a very profound injury prevention thing because they're stopping you from hurting yourself by doing the exercise wrong in the work weight zone because you've worked your way up in the movement practice and confidence to the point where you can do the weight. And I'm speaking from experience here. I know exactly what this feels like. So I think really it makes a lot of sense to essentially look at warm-ups through a slightly different lens rather than just saying, when we're warming up for a squat, we do it this way because that's essentially essential. You go, hang on a minute, but those aren't really the ways in which you would reduce injury risk if you were starting from scratch and planning a warm-up with a machine exercise that is not requiring that steady progression of confidence and movement practice to get to the same place. Actually, if I'm planning an overhead press in a machine, if I'm doing a seated overhead press in a machine, then what I really want to be doing is getting my arm muscles warm, delts warm, my back warm, and then I want to be doing a PAP effect. And by doing that, then I've potentially got a little bit more hypertrophy stimulus, maybe, don't know for sure. And I've definitely got, a PAP effect plus muscle temperature increase, which is going to reduce my risk of a muscle strain injury, if that would even really be a problem in that scenario.
Is something like an elliptical, is that actually sufficient to warm up like the muscles in your arms and your back? Like, is that
Well,
actually
if you're
going to
using your arms, yes. I mean, if you're just kind of resting them on
just
the
passively holding it?
yeah, that's not going to work. So, you've got to be proactively thinking about what you're trying to get out of the exercise. And again, what we're really doing here is we're only really talking about muscle strain injury. People could say, well, what about tendinopathy? What about, sort of articulation issues? You could kind of say, well, what about them? I mean, until there's a literature base that can tell you how those injuries happen and how you can reduce the risk of them happening in a strength training context, I don't really have any data to go with. I mean, it's I talk about muscle strain injury because that's what we've got data for.
Can I ask, how do you warm up in your workouts?
So at my age now, I don't have to do. I don't really spend any time doing free weight exercises particularly. So I'm basically going to be doing machine stuff, and my approach is I do my aerobic exercise warm up, and then I do basically probably only 2 or 3 sets of either singles or doubles with the machine that I'm going to do for each machine, and I rush through them. So I will sit. Let's describe the seated overhead press because that's generally the thing that I kind of will start with because that's my weakest sort of lift. So I will go to the machine, I'll sit down, and I will immediately put it to about 50% of the weight I'm going to use, approximately, and I'll do 1 or 2 repetitions with that. All I'm doing when I do that is just making sure that there's nothing fundamentally wrong with me that's appeared overnight since I last did the exercise. Now, at my age, that is a real possibility. I could find that I sit down on the machine and something really just screams at me, and it's because I've slept on the wrong side of the bed or, I've just, kind of done something that I shouldn't have done. So I do. That's literally a test. It's like, does anything feel horrible? And then I put the weight up again to usually about sort of 10, 20% below what I'm planning to do as a work weight. And I do the same thing again. I just test. Does it feel horrible? Does it feel okay? And if that feels okay, I'll then usually move up to my work weight or relatively close to that. And I'll do a single high effort repetition, and then I'll wait a minute or so, and then I'll do my work set. And that's basically I get there in about a minute. It doesn't take me any time at all. And if I'm doing sort of single sets, which is what I normally do, again, at my age, I'm not trying to add any muscle particularly. I'm just trying to keep what I've got, and I'll just go and move to a different machine and do the same thing again. I do tend to always do that practice, even though I might be doing multiple sort of overlapping muscle groups. So I might do a row, I might also do a pull down, do some rear delt stuff, whatever. I will always do that process because I'm actually doing the warm up to test that my body isn't broken. That's what I'm using the warm up process for. Other people might use the process for different, but that's all I'm doing.
Yeah.
I'm just making sure nothing's going to go wrong.
That's an interesting point, what you just said there, that other people might be using it for other purposes, because there are,
Absolutely.
in fact, other purposes you could use it for. So
Yeah,
one thing I
totally.
do sometimes, not all the time, and sometimes is I use my warm-up for a similar. So actually I integrate like clusters into my warm-up. So the first exercise I do of the day, so I'll do maybe, 10, 15 minutes walking or whatever. And then the first exercise, I might do one or two kind of warm-up sets, again, just kind of feeling it out. Usually just one set, to be honest. And then I go up to my 5-rep max and I'll just perform a number of singles with that. And for me, that'll be, and I often for that exercise, I won't even do more than just those singles. I'll just do those singles and then I'll move into the next exercise for that muscle. And so that's achieved a PAP effect for that following exercise. So, I guess I'm trying to get something slightly different out of it. I do want to circle back around because I know people are asking this question. You said you do your whole little sequence in only a minute or two. So people will be asking, how long do I need to rest between warm-up sets?
It depends how many reps you're doing. I mean, I literally do 1 or 2 repetitions with each, and I'm doing 2 or 3 sets with sequential weights. And I don't feel any fatigue, particularly when I'm doing that. So I just bash straight through them. Because again, the purpose of me doing them, apart from the final PAP rep, the purpose of me doing them is testing that there's no problem. And I've talked to a number of other elderly lifters. I classify myself as an elderly lifter at this point. That we kind of all say the same thing. It's like you do not go jumping straight into. Like I couldn't do what you're describing, for example, where you might go from a row to a pull down or something like that, and just bang straight into your work rate. I just would never do that because I could literally find that my entire back just lights up like a Christmas tree. And when I pull, I just don't know that that's going to happen. In the last year, I've done something like that twice. In fact, even with all the precautions I take, I've been in a situation where I've pulled back is my problem because I spent so much time doing one-arm chins and heavy weight pull-ups that I think I got maybe a couple of issues as a result of doing that. And now sometimes I can pull really, really hard. I can max pull down machines out relatively easily, and it just twinges, and my whole back lights up, and I'm walking around like Quasimodo for the next couple of days. And that's just what happens, I think. And so I have to be super careful. And I think a lot of us older lifters are. We kind of just want to make sure that we haven't seized up overnight and created an issue that's going to come to light halfway through a set.
So after that final 1 or 2 repetitions you do, and that's with let's say like max effort, that's achieving that PAP effect, even though they're only a single or double, would you wait then before your working set? How long would you wait for that working set?
Yeah, if I just go by feel. So if my final PAP rep is like with a sort of lower weight, I'm not super specific about this. And the reason I'm not super specific is because I don't take my training as seriously as people who are trying to achieve a particular, kind of goal that they've got in mind. I'm just trying to hang on to everything that I've got, or as much of what I got as I can. So I'm literally thinking about a maintenance program where I've got a high variety of exercises, and I'm just trying to hit single sets with a high enough level of effort to keep what I've got. There's no capacity for me to grow at my age, so I'm kind of looking at things from a different perspective. Also, the gym is not my life. I've got an entirely different life outside of the gym that is much more important to me. So, that's just I will just go through and I'll do a final PAP rep. And if it doesn't feel fatiguing because it was maybe a little bit lighter, then I'll just give it 30 seconds and I'll go into the work set. if I've done a work repetition, then maybe I'll leave it a little bit longer. But I do get questions when people will say to me, oh, I'm doing this warm up, and they're describing they're doing like 10 reps with this weight, and then they're waiting a couple of minutes, then doing another 10 reps. I'm like, what are you even trying to achieve? There's nothing in that physiological matrix that we've worked through that is stimulated by doing 10 reps with 50% of your work weight. It does nothing. It doesn't get you the temperature increase. It doesn't get you the PAPE increase. It doesn't get you the PAPE increase. What's it achieving? It does nothing. So I do think that the general approach to warm-ups is probably quite wrong.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I do think most of the warm-ups you look at, they don't seem to be doing really anything. And in fact, you could argue based on what they are achieving, you could just probably skip the warm-ups entirely. Like it doesn't.
It's probably just creating fatigue that they've then got to sit and wait out before they can move to the next warm-up set and then sit and wait the fatigue from that. And does it really actually enhance performance or reduce injury risk? Yeah. It's not hitting any of the three bases that we've described. So, maybe it's not doing anything apart from that confidence thing again, which is, maybe not even that necessary if they're working with machine exercises.
I really think that is so exercise specific. I mean, obviously this is just N of one anecdote, but I come from a background where warm-ups were emphasized. We did a lot of warm-ups. Everything you would do, you do 3 sets of warm-ups. You do your 8 to 10, like you've just described. And, I was always taught, like, you have to do this, injury prevention, CNS, priming, all this stuff, yeah? And then only over the last couple of years have I started to kind of question, do I need these warm-ups? And over the last maybe 2 years, I'm at a point now where, I don't know, at least 50% of the exercises I do, I don't warm up at all. And like you described there, like the first exercise for that muscle, I will, and then often I won't really do anything. And especially if it's a curl, a machine exercise, stuff that, a squat or whatever, I will, but most machine exercise, leg extensions I still do because that'll hurt my knees. But apart from that, a leg curl, I don't. And I've been doing this for a while now and I don't feel any worse for it. I haven't gotten injured. I don't feel any body pains. I don't feel like my performance has dropped by any means. And it's like dogma. And it's like, you have to do this. And it's like, well, hang on, do you? Test it out. And I'm not sure why we have to do this.
Yeah, I think the closest I get to not doing a warm-up is probably a rear delt fly. So I know exactly what weight I use on the rear delt fly in the machine, the gym that I go to, and I will usually just go there and I will do a single set of either 1 or 2 reps with about 80% of that weight, and then I'll just literally move the selector to my work weight and I'll just go straight into doing my work set. So I literally sit down, bang, I'll do 2 reps with a 80%, and then I go straight into our work set, and that's it. That's the closest I get. But that's because I've never had an issue with rear delt flies in any point in my life. It's the kind of the rows and the pull downs that scare me, really. That's the scenario where I've kind of hurt myself in the past. But yeah, I think what you're describing is very interesting. I mean, before this podcast, I said to you, one of the concerns I have about answering the question when people say to me, what should I do as a warm-up? I say, well, what I'm going to do is describe what I do, and then you can decide what you do. I can't tell you what to do because the problem about warm-ups is that our community regards warm-ups as being integral to injury prevention. So if I tell you to do something and then you get hurt, then you can then come back and yell at me and tell me it's my fault. I'm not going to tell you how to do that because I don't want to put myself in that situation of having that responsibility. So I can tell you what I do. And if you, find that useful, that hopefully that is useful. But ultimately, I can't give you a kind of a sort of a distinctive recipe to follow because that then puts me at risk of you blaming me for you getting hurt in the future. So you said to me you didn't think that other people are that smart.
I just said I don't think that influencers think about the consequence of what they say necessarily.
Which I interpreted as you telling me that you don't think that much.
that was the interpretation. For what it's worth, what I tell my groups to do as far as warm-ups is I say, this is super individual. I say some people may feel like they don't need any, and some people may feel like they need 3 or 4, or maybe even more if we're doing something like a squat. And so I say, ultimately, it is up to you. In general, I recommend 1 to 2, and it would be 1, which would be very, very light, nothing on the bar, just make sure everything works, like your little test. And then the second one would be to achieve that PAP effect. And so that could be a higher load or it could be a max effort. But I'm more than happy to say if you don't feel like you need any, don't do any. So I do think there's, individualization there. And I don't think we need to be so prescriptive as to say everyone must do 4 warm-up sets or whatever. Obviously it depends what you're trying to achieve as well.
Yeah, I think really the important factor I think that's come out of this kind of conversation is that the very mainstream approach to warming up, which is where you do like 10 reps with a lightweight and then 10 reps with a slightly, or 8 reps with a slightly heavier weight, and then 5 and then 3 and then 2, and you work your way up in a pyramid form to your work weight. That really does nothing really physiologically sort of valid. There's no physiological mechanism to explain what that is doing. Even if you want to go down the route of saying, well, okay, well, how am I supposed to warm up for a back squat exercise? Well, even then, yes, you would work up through a series of weights, but you don't need to do 10 repetitions at any point. You're talking 2 or 3 repetitions with each of your increments. There's no sense in doing 10. There's no scenario in which 10 is a good idea. From the mechanisms that we described, we want muscle temperature increases. Well, that's going to be about your aerobic warm-up. It's not going to be, or whatever else you do. It's not going to be about the exercise-specific warm-up. PAPE and PAPE, both of those are going to be about the final thing you do just before you do your work set. Everything up to that point, the only reason you do it is confidence. And in my case, at my age, making sure everything still works, confidence and movement practice. As you pointed out, if you're dealing with machine exercises where you don't need any real confidence booster or movement practice, you can jump really quickly through those. As I've described, I jump really quickly through my rear delt fly because it just feels so ridiculously easy to kind of do the movement, and I don't feel I need any kind of confidence because I feel like the exercise has always been safe for me. So yeah, I think the individuality is that kind of confidence and movement practice side. The other stuff is actually got nothing to do with the exercise specific warm-up at all.
I don't want to beat this topic to death, but I do have one final question for you and then we'll wrap up. Over warm-ups. What's happening there? Is anything different that we should talk about there?
So this is one of those things where, again, I just have to say there could be something really interesting here or there could be nothing here. What is probably happening with an over warm-up is where we use a heavier than weight than we're going to use for the work set is almost certainly just a change in the way the brain perceives the effort required to do the movement. If that is the case, then what you're going to get is an increase in motor unit recruitment for the movement that you're going to do, which is fantastic. But I don't know whether that is the case. So somebody needs to go and do a test to see if performance is increased by doing a single heavier load, but they need to use a control group that isn't just no over warm-up. They need to do a single max effort rep with the same weight or a lighter weight to create a PAP effect as well. So it needs to control for the PAP effect. So what you need to do if you want to construct an experiment to test this, and you could actually test this yourself. I mean, there's no reason why you can't test this yourself. You would fix your rest period between what we call conditioning contraction and the main set. So you would say, I'm going to do a single repetition either with, my work weight plus 10%, or I'm going to do a single repetition with my work weight minus 10%, both with maximal efforts. And then I'm going to wait 3 minutes or 2 minutes, better probably 2 minutes, and then I'm going to do my work set. If the over warm-up is beneficial for reasons additional to the PAP, then you will get a superior effect on your work set. If it is basically just a PAP, then you'll get the same effect as the control group, which used your work weight minus 10% instead of your work weight plus 10%. I just wrote a study design for somebody if they're interested in testing that. But that would be, and the thing is, some people report that it does seem to have a beneficial effect. I played around with it about 6 months to a year ago, and initially I thought it might help, and then I realized it wasn't really having a beneficial effect for me, but other people's mileage may vary. Until somebody goes and does some work on it, I don't think we're going to know whether it on average works for most people most of the time, or if it just doesn't really work for most people.
My 2 cents would be for most people who are trying to do the over warm-up, it's probably meaning that they are getting that PAP effect, and most likely their normal warm-up is not achieving that PAP effect.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think you're probably right there. I suspect that it's just creating a PAPE effect where one wasn't there previously. So, but yeah, as I say, in the event that it does create an effect, it's almost certainly going to be this change in the perception of the load and the heaviness of the load, which therefore makes it feel easier, and therefore you can then push your effort perception to your normal maximal level, and actually now you're coinciding with a high level of recovery. Whether that happens is entirely speculative. I do not know.
That's it. That's our warm-up episode done. Thank you guys for joining us. Hopefully you'll join us again next week.